It was late afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun filtering softly through the window, casting long shadows across the room. The air smelled faintly of dust, mingling with the subtle scent of lavender from the sachets I'd placed in the corners of the room weeks ago. I was standing near my dresser, cleaning, as I had a habit of doing when the mood struck me. I didn't mind it. There was something soothing about tidying up a space that had, over time, become mine. I ran the soft cloth over the surface of the cabinet, its warm wood grain visible beneath the dust, when I heard the door creak. It was a faint sound, easily drowned out by the rhythmic swish of the cloth, but it caught my attention just enough to stop me mid-motion. Without thinking, I turned around, expecting to see nothing more than the usual emptiness of my bedroom. But then I saw him. The unexpected moment standing in the doorway. He wasn't supposed to be home. I knew his routine. Alden, my 23-year-old stepson, worked at a local brewery and usually stayed out with his friends after shifts, lingering in the dim light of bars and the laughter of his peers. He had a way of blending in with his friends, of becoming part of whatever group he was in, charming everyone with his easygoing nature and good looks. But there he was, staring at me, his blue eyes sharp and searching. His gaze didn't just skim over me, it lingered, narrowing in on the thing in my hands. My heart skipped a beat. I knew exactly what he was looking at. It was a large, brightly colored toy, something completely out of place in a house like ours, in a room like this. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect a 40-year-old woman to casually pull out while cleaning. I had grabbed it out of the drawer to dust behind the cabinet, not giving it much thought. My thoughts were elsewhere, preoccupied with the task at hand, when I'd unearthed the forgotten object. The moment felt like time had slowed down. The toy, harmless in its innocence, felt like a glaring beacon in my hands now that Alden was standing there watching. How could I explain it? How could I possibly tell him the truth? The awkward silence. Alden stood still, not saying a word, just staring at the toy and then back at me. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks as the awkward silence stretched between us. How could I make this less awkward? How could I recover from this? What's that? Alden's voice cut through the quiet, his tone caught somewhere between teasing and genuinely curious. My face flushed even more. I could feel the blood rushing to my face, a hot wave of embarrassment sweeping over me. I dropped the toy instinctively as if it had burned me, and grabbed the nearest object I could find, a throw pillow from the bed. My fingers fumbled as I thrust it into my chest, desperately trying to cover the toy like it didn't matter, like the situation was somehow under control. "It's none of your business," I managed to stammer, my throat tightening with the effort to regain my composure. But Alden wasn't making this any easier. He hadn't moved an inch. If anything, his amusement deepened. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression now one of amused curiosity, and the silence grew heavier, more charged. "You know," he said, his voice light but edged with an unfamiliar understanding, "you don't have to act so embarrassed. It's not like I haven't seen something like that before." I could feel the air in the room shift, a tension filling the space between us. How could he be so casual about it? How could he stand there, not just unmoved, but amused? He wasn't embarrassed, wasn't acting like it was anything out of the ordinary, and it made me feel like I was the one overreacting, like I was the one who was wrong. I laughed nervously, trying to diffuse the situation. "Alden, seriously, go mind your own business," I said, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, him or myself. For a moment, he didn't budge. The silence between us stretched further, unbearably long. And as I stared back at him, I realized that his gaze had shifted. It wasn't playful anymore. It wasn't casual. He was looking at me differently now. His blue eyes were intense, thoughtful, and oddly searching. The smile that had been on his lips moments before had faded into something unreadable. In that moment I felt exposed, as if he could see through the mask I had so carefully cultivated, as if somehow something had been laid bare between us, a layer I hadn't even known existed. I cleared my throat, desperate to break the tension. "Please, Alden, just go. The words came out almost pleading, but he only shrugged in response, lifting his hands in mock surrender. All right, he said, his tone light again, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach twist. Just before he left, he gave me one last look, a glance that lingered just long enough to send a shiver down my spine. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. I stood there, frozen for a long moment, still clutching the pillow to my chest as though it could somehow shield me from the overwhelming sense of discomfort. My heart was racing. My pulse was erratic. How had we gotten here? The quiet aftermath. I tried to move on, tried to shake off the weirdness of the moment, but it lingered in the air like an odor you can't scrub out, no matter how much you clean. Dinner was a dull, repetitive chore. I set the table mechanically, trying to ignore the faint feeling of unease that refused to go away. I folded laundry, putting it away in a daze. Even sitting next to Victor on the couch while he flipped through old westerns on the TV didn't help. I should have felt at ease, but my mind kept circling back to Alden, his look, his words, the unsettling way he had seen me. Victor, of course, didn't notice anything. He was lost in his crossword puzzle or his gardening books or whatever project he was focused on at the time. That had been the rhythm of our life for years now. Ever since his retirement, things had changed. There were days when I felt like nothing more than a caretaker, running the house, making sure everything was in order, picking up the slack where Victor's interests began to wane. But there was no resentment in it. It was just the way it had become. I had accepted it. But now, with Alden in the house again, things felt different. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside Victor, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, Alden's face appeared in my mind, that teasing smirk. The way his eyes had lingered on mine for a fraction too long. It felt like something had shifted, but I couldn't place what. It was like the whole dynamic between us had been subtly altered in a way I couldn't undo. The unsettling shift. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I prepared breakfast for Victor as I always did, eggs and toast with a cup of coffee, while I made a smoothie for myself. The routine was comforting, familiar, but there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't shake. Every glance Alden shot my way felt charged. Each small gesture from him felt deliberate. When we passed the salt at the table, when I reached to fill my coffee mug, it was as though his hand brushed mine on purpose. It was too much for a mere breakfast. "How's work?" I asked Victor, trying to distract myself, but he barely looked up, lost in his crossword. Alden, on the other hand, watched me with a steady gaze. Every so often his eyes would flicker to mine, and I'd catch him studying me with that same unreadable expression. After breakfast, Alden surprised me by offering to help clean up. Normally, he would disappear into his room or leave to hang out with his friends. But today, he stayed behind, picking up plates and offering to dry. We worked together in silence for a while, but I could feel the tension rising in the air between us. There was a weight to every action, a heaviness that I couldn't ignore. At one point, I reached for a glass just as Alden did. Our hands brushed, and for a long, breathless moment, neither of us moved. I could feel the heat from his skin, the subtle warmth of his presence. Then, breaking the silence, Alden spoke. His voice was quiet, but his words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You're different," he said, almost to himself. "Different?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before answering, his gaze still locked onto mine. "You don't act like other women your age. You're real. You actually listen, you see people." His words caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond. Instead, I busied myself with wiping the counter, trying to break the tension, but I could feel his presence hovering behind me. I wanted him to stay. I shouldn't have wanted him to stay. Just as I thought I might lose my composure, Victor's voice called from the living room, pulling me back to reality. "Melina, where's my crossword book?" I stepped back, grateful for the interruption. Alden, with a small, knowing smile, stepped away. "I'll let you get back to him," he said lightly, and I could hear the subtle shift in his tone, as though the moment had passed. But it hadn't passed. I could still feel the heat of his words, the intensity of his gaze. Reflection and tension. Later that afternoon, I found myself walking outside. The house felt stifling and I needed space. When I walked out to the porch, I found Alden sitting on the steps, staring out at the yard. He looked different, thoughtful, distant, lost in some private contemplation I wasn't part of. He was still the same tall, lean figure with dark hair and blue eyes, but there was something deeper beneath the surface now. "Hey," I said, softly approaching him. He looked up, his face breaking into a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. "Everything all right?" I asked, sitting down beside him, though I kept a careful distance. His gaze was focused on the yard, but it felt like he wasn't really seeing anything. "Yeah," he said after a moment, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Just thinking about life. What's next, you know?" I could sense the weight of his words, the doubt that had crept into his mind. He wasn't the carefree young man I was used to. He was struggling with something deeper, something I didn't understand but could sense in the air. "You're young, Alden," I said softly, trying to offer some comfort. "You don't have to have it all figured out yet." He nodded slowly, but the heaviness didn't leave his eyes. Then, after a long pause, he added, "You ever feel like you're meant for something different? Like you're trapped in the wrong story?" The tension between us Alden's words struck me harder than I cared to admit. They weren't just careless words flung into the air. They were pointed, and they resonated with a truth I wasn't ready to face. I had spent years hiding behind a veneer of stability, of control, but in that moment the cracks in my facade felt more obvious than ever. I had always prided myself on being the one who could hold everything together, the one who managed the house, kept the peace, and supported everyone around me. But as Alden spoke, something inside me trembled. I wanted to comfort him, tell him everything would work out the way it was supposed to. But the truth was, I didn't believe that myself. I was stuck, just as stuck as he seemed to feel. I was bound to a life I didn't recognize anymore, and I wasn't sure how to break free from the invisible chains that held me in place. The reality of our situation weighed heavily on me, but I couldn't allow myself to admit it, not even to Alden. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer some semblance of reassurance. My touch was soft, tentative, but it felt like it carried all the unsaid things between us. He didn't pull away, and that was the problem. The subtle pressure of his hand covering mine felt impossibly intimate, a quiet admission that we both understood something unspoken, something dangerous. I pulled away quickly, but it was too late. The boundary had already been crossed, and the air between us was different now. Every moment from that point onward felt charged, as if we were playing a game with no rules, no clear line between what was acceptable and what wasn't. And deep down, I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop it anymore. The storm in the house. That evening, the sky darkened ominously. Thick clouds rolled in from the horizon, and the air seemed to grow heavier by the minute. The storm that loomed on the horizon mirrored the storm inside me, restless, unpredictable, and utterly beyond my control. The winds howled outside, rattling the windows and sending an eerie creak through the house. It felt as though the world itself was waiting for something to happen, some shift that would change everything. Victor had gone to bed early, as he often did. He complained of an aching shoulder, a common grievance of his these days. With his advancing age and increasing detachment, he spent more time in his own world, oblivious to the shifts happening in the house around him. I, on the other hand, had settled into the living room with a book in hand, attempting to retreat into its pages, hoping it would distract me from the tumult of my thoughts. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't focus. The words blurred together, and my mind kept returning to the conversation with Alden. His words, his presence, his touch. From the kitchen, I could hear the faint sound of the fridge opening and closing, the clink of glass as Alden poured himself a drink. The noises were so ordinary, yet they felt out of place in the stillness of the house. After a few moments, he appeared in the doorway of the living room, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. "Whiskey?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I blinked, caught off guard. "I don't usually drink this late," I said, my voice uncertain. "Well," he said with a grin, "maybe tonight's an exception." Without waiting for a response, he handed me one of the glasses. I hesitated, but my fingers instinctively wrapped around the cool glass, as if I needed something to anchor me to reality. Alden sank into the armchair across from me, stretching his legs out casually. The lamp beside me cast a warm glow across his face, illuminating the sharp angles of his jaw and the faint shadow of stubble on his chin. He looked so effortlessly relaxed, so in control, and I found myself envying that ease. "What are you reading?" he asked, his eyes drifting to the book in my lap. "Just something light," I replied, holding it up briefly. "Nothing exciting." He smirked, clearly skeptical. "I find that hard to believe." I laughed softly, lifting the glass to my lips. The whiskey burned as it slid down my throat, a welcome distraction from the knot of tension that had been tightening in my chest all evening. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the storm outside growing louder, the wind howling as it battered against the house. But then Alden spoke again, his voice lower this time, filled with a question that sent a jolt through me. "Can I ask you something?" I glanced at him wearily, already sensing where this conversation might go. "Depends on what it is." He swirled the liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed on it as though he were choosing his words carefully. "Do you ever feel stuck?" His question caught me off guard. It was eerily similar to the one he'd asked earlier on the porch, but there was something different about it now. The tone had shifted. There was more weight behind it, more of an invitation for something deeper, something more vulnerable. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself before answering. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. I wasn't sure why I had confessed that to him. There was something about Alden, something about the way he looked at me that made it impossible to lie. He looked up at me then, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "You don't seem like someone who should be stuck. You're too alive for that." The words hit me harder than I expected. They were a compliment, but they stung. I looked away, suddenly self-conscious. My cheeks flushed, and I set the glass down on the coffee table with a soft clink. "Alden, you shouldn't say things like that," I said, my voice low, trying to push the discomfort away. But I could tell from the look on his face that he didn't regret what he'd said. "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "It's true." I stood abruptly, needing to distance myself from the growing heat between us. "I think it's time we call it a night," I said, avoiding his gaze. I needed to escape this conversation, this moment, but before I could leave the room, the power went out. The house plunged into sudden darkness, and I froze. "Oh," I muttered, my voice shaky. "It's just the storm." "It's fine." Alden's voice was calm, almost reassuring. "I'll find a flashlight." I heard him stand, his feet soft on the carpet as he moved across the room. Then his hand brushed against mine in the dark, and my breath hitched. It was a small touch, but it felt like an electric current had passed through us. "Sorry," he murmured, but his hand didn't pull away. Instead, it lingered, warm and steady against mine. The air between us shifted again, thick with something unsaid, something dangerous. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythm of it deafening in my ears. "Melina," he whispered, his voice low and intimate, sending a shiver down my spine. I turned toward him, even though I couldn't see him in the dark, but I could feel him, his presence, his warmth. I could feel his breath, steady and measured, and then his hand slid up my wrist, holding it gently, sending another wave of heat through my body. "This is a bad idea," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, his voice steady despite the situation. "But I can't stop." The first crack of lightning lit up the room for just a split second, illuminating his face. In that brief flash, I saw him, earnest, vulnerable, impossibly close. And then, before I could pull away, he kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't push him away. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands gripping his shirt as though he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. The kiss deepened, urgent and raw, and I felt every inch of my body respond to him, to the pull between us that had been growing for weeks. When the lights flickered back on, we broke apart, both of us breathing hard, our chests rising and falling in unison. The reality of what we had just done hit me like a wave, crashing over me with the force of 1,000 emotions I didn't know how to handle. "This can't happen," I said, shaking my head, my voice thick with the weight of regret. Alden didn't argue. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said again, his voice steady, but the damage was done. It was too late. The aftermath. The next few days passed in a blur of stolen glances, unspoken words, and nervous tension. I tried to avoid Alden as much as I could, throwing myself into chores and errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the feel of his lips on mine, the way his hand had lingered on my wrist, or the way his presence seemed to pull me in despite everything. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the guest room, I heard a soft knock at the door. I looked up to find Alden standing in the doorway, his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm, but with a hint of something softer underneath. I didn't look up immediately. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, my voice tight, but he stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. I sighed, setting the laundry down and finally meeting his gaze. "Alden," I began, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his tone challenging. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You don't understand," I said, my voice rising. "If Victor ever found out—" "He won't," Alden interrupted. "And even if he did, do you really think he'd care? He barely notices you anymore." His words stung more than I cared to admit, partly because they were true. But that didn't make them right. "This isn't about him," I snapped, my voice shaking. "It's about us. About the fact that this can't happen. It's not just wrong. It's impossible." Alden stepped closer, his eyes locked onto mine, as if he were searching for some sign that I still felt what he felt. "Why?" he asked softly. "Because you're afraid of what people might think? Because you're afraid of what you might think." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I didn't know how to explain the war raging inside me, the guilt, the fear, the longing. So instead, I just shook my head and pushed past him, leaving the room without another word.